She had 4 minutes to catch this flight. She didn't know it would change her entire life. All the seats on this plane, fate put her right next to them. She had no idea it was the beginning of everything. Weeks later, she walked into a hospital for business. She walked out with his number, one question, and she made a choice that would define the rest of her life. She wasn't scared of loving him, she was scared of how much she already did.
If you have ever pretended everything was fine when it absolutely was not, this story is going to hit you right in the chest. Before we begin, hit that like button and subscribe, because trust me, you are going to want to be here for the ending. Now let's get into it. Ava Bennett had exactly 4 minutes to get to gate 17. A laptop bag digging into her shoulder, a suitcase wheel that squeaked like a dying bird, and a headache that had started somewhere over Ohio and had not let up since. She was 34 years old, the founder and CEO of a logistics software company called Rivermark, and she had just spent 3 days convincing a room full of investors in Chicago that her company was worth $40 in dollars. She had won. She had also not slept properly in 5 days, had eaten exactly 1 real meal since Tuesday, and had a stress rash forming under her left collarbone that she was doing her best to ignore. She was not thinking about love. She was not thinking about family. She was thinking about the fact that if she missed this flight, she would miss her sister's rehearsal dinner, and her mother would never, ever let her hear the end of it. She made the gate with 90 seconds to spare, and that was when she first saw him. A man crouched down at the edge of the boarding line, tying the shoelace of a small boy who could not have been older than 5. The boy had a stuffed elephant tucked under one arm, and was talking a mile a minute about dinosaurs. And the man, tall, broad-shouldered, wearing a slightly wrinkled button-down, like he'd been just out, was nodding along with the patient, practiced calm of someone who had heard every dinosaur fact in existence at least 6 times already. Ava didn't think anything of it. Not yet. She stepped around them, apologized when her suitcase clipped his ankle, and boarded the plane. Of course, fate, or more accurately, whoever assigns seats on discount economy fares, put her directly next to them. 14C, window. Next to 14B, the little boy. Next to 14A, the father. Sorry, the man said immediately, gathering a small backpack covered in dinosaur patches off her seat. He likes to spread out. It's fine, Ava said, and meant it, mostly because she was too tired to mean anything else. His name was Daniel Reyes. She learned this only because the boy, whose name was Milo, announced it for him. That's my daddy, Daniel. He's a nurse. He fixes people's hearts. Milo said this with the absolute confidence of a 5-year-old who has decided his father is the single greatest man who has ever lived, which, as it turned out, was not far from the truth. Ava smiled despite herself. A cardiac nurse? ICU, actually, Daniel said. Milo's version is more flattering. It's accurate, Milo insisted, already flipping through a well-loved picture book of dinosaurs. Somewhere over the next 2 hours, in the particular intimacy that only happens between strangers trapped together at 30,000 feet, Ava learned that Daniel's wife had died 3 years ago. An aneurysm, sudden, no warning, gone in an afternoon, and that he had been raising Milo alone ever since, working night shifts so he could do school pickup, running on the kind of exhaustion that Ava recognized because she wore a version of it herself, just dressed in a different outfit. She learned that Milo loved the ocean, hated peas, and had strong opinions about which dinosaurs could beat which other dinosaurs in a fight. She learned that Daniel had a laugh that started low in his chest, and that he used it sparingly, like he was rationing something precious. She learned, without meaning to learn it, that she liked being near both of them more than she said had liked being near anyone in a very long time. When the boy fell asleep against his father's arm, somewhere over Nebraska, Daniel looked over at Ava and said quietly, "Thank you for being kind to him. Some people get annoyed. He's charming," Ava said. "He get that from you?" "His mother," Daniel said, and something moved behind his eyes. Brief and old and still tender. "I just try to keep up." Ava didn't know what compelled her to say the next thing. Maybe it was the altitude. Maybe it was 3 days of performing confidence for a room of men in expensive suits and, finally being allowed to just sit quietly next to someone who wasn't asking anything of her. "You're doing more than keeping up," she said. "You're doing all of it. That's not small." Daniel looked at her for a long moment, like he was recalibrating something. "That's the nicest thing anyone's said to me in a while." Neither of them mentioned it, but something had shifted, the way the air shifts before rain. Not dramatic, not obvious, just a change in pressure that both of them felt, and neither of them named. The flight landed. They said polite goodbyes at baggage claim, the kind of goodbye that feels like it should mean something but is really just two strangers returning to two separate lives. Ava told herself she would not think about them again. She was wrong within 11 days. Rivermark's biggest client, a hospital network called Cedar Point Health, was rolling out Ava's new logistics platform to manage medical equipment inventory across their intensive care units. Ava, ever hands-on, insisted on visiting the flagship hospital herself to observe the pilot launch. She walked into the ICU on a Tuesday morning in a charcoal blazer, expecting spreadsheets and stakeholders. She found Daniel Reyes checking vitals on a patient in bed 6. "You," he said. And for a second, his professional composure cracked into something like disbelief, and then a smile that he clearly tried and failed to suppress. "Me," Ava said. "Small world. Or a very efficient logistics network. Take your pick." They had approximately 90 seconds of actual conversation before both of them were pulled into their respective jobs. But it was enough. It was enough for Daniel to ask, almost shyly, if she'd like to grab coffee sometime, and enough for Ava, CEO of a $40 million company, a woman who had not made room for anyone in her calendar for the better part of 3 years, to say yes, without hesitating even once. Their first real date was, appropriately, at a dinosaur-themed pizza place, because Milo's babysitter had canceled, and Daniel had apologetically offered to reschedule, and Ava had said, "No. Bring him. I want to meet the dinosaur expert properly." It should have felt strange. It did not. Milo remembered her instantly, informed her that the Spinosaurus was actually longer than the T-Rex, and asked, with zero social filter, if she was going to be his dad's girlfriend now. Daniel had nearly choked on his soda. Ava had laughed so hard she'd had to put her fork down. "We'll see," she'd told Milo, and something about the easy honesty of that answer had made Ava had something you're afraid to want too much. Their second date, if you could even call it that, happened almost by accident. Daniel texted her at 11 at night, an apologetic, half-formed message that trailed off mid-sentence, and when Ava called instead of texting back, she found him sitting alone in the hospital break room, still in scrubs, having just watched a 41-year-old father of 2 lose his fight after a massive cardiac event. "I'm fine," he told her, in the specific tone of voice people use when they are the furthest thing from fine. Ava didn't argue with him. She simply stayed on the phone, not saying much, letting him talk when he wanted to, and letting him sit in silence when he didn't, until his shift ended at 6 in the morning. When he finally walked out to the parking lot, exhausted and hollowed out, she was there, leaning against her car with 2 coffees, having driven across town in the middle of the night, because some instinct told her showing up mattered more than saying the right thing. Daniel would later tell her that was the night he knew, not with fireworks, not with some grand declaration, but with the quiet, bone-deep realization that here was someone who understood that love. Real love often looks like just showing up when it's inconvenient. Over the following months, it became the 3 of them, quietly, unofficially, the way things become real before anyone gives them a name. Ava learned Milo's school schedule. She learned which nights Daniel worked overnight shifts and started showing up without being asked, to make sure Milo had dinner and got his bath and didn't fall asleep with the hall light off, which apparently was a crisis of epic proportions. She learned the particular exhaustion in Daniel's shoulders after a bad shift, the ones where a patient didn't make it, and she learned how to just sit next to him in silence until he was ready to talk, or ready not to. And Daniel learned Ava too. The version of her that existed underneath the CEO. He learned that she called her mother every Sunday without fail, that she still felt guilty about a co-founder she'd had to let go 3 years ago, that she'd built her entire company partly to prove something to a father who had told her, when she was 19, that she was too soft for business. He learned that she cried during Milo's school plays, every single time, even the ones where Milo was cast as a background tree. There were harder nights too, the kind that don't make it into the highlight reel of a love story, but that quietly build the foundation of one. There was the night Milo spiked a fever of 104 at 2 in the morning, and Daniel, normally so steady, so clinically calm in the face of medical emergencies involving strangers, had gone pale and shaky at the sight of his own son shivering under 3-way blankets. Ava had driven them to the emergency room herself, had sat in the waiting room chair beside him, gripping his hand, while doctors ran tests, had talked him down from the particular spiral only a parent who has already lost someone can fall into. He is not her, Ava had said quietly, guessing correctly at the shape of his fear. This is a virus, Daniel, not an aneurysm. You know the difference better than anyone in this building. It turned out to be a bad ear infection, treatable, ordinary, the kind every child gets at some point. But Ava never forgot the way Daniel had held her hand in that waiting room, like she was the only solid thing keeping him upright. And Daniel never forgot that she'd known exactly what to say, and exactly when to just stay silent and let him breathe. There was also the harder, quieter conflict that lived inside Ava's own chest, the one she didn't talk about, even to Daniel, for a long time. Rivermark was in the middle of a difficult second funding round, and one of her original investors, a sharp-tongued venture capitalist named Griffin Hale, made it clear in a board meeting that he thought her personal distractions, his words, delivered with a thin, unbothered smile, were affecting her focus. You used to eat, sleep, and breathe this company, he told her, in front of 4 other board members. Now you're leaving at 5 to make some kid's soccer practice. I'm not saying it's wrong. I'm saying the market will notice. Ava sat through the rest of that meeting with her jaw tight and her hands folded, saying nothing, and drove straight to Milo's soccer practice afterward anyway, sat on the sideline in her blazer, and watched a 7-year-old chase a ball in the wrong direction with the kind of joy that made the entire ugly conversation feel very small and very far away. But it had planted a seed of doubt she couldn't quite pull out. That night, she asked Daniel, half joking, half serious, whether he ever worried she loved the company more than she loved them. Daniel didn't laugh. He took the question seriously, the way he took everything about her seriously, and said, I think you love us in the hours you don't have to give. That's not the same as loving us less. That's loving us on purpose. Ava cried a little that night, the good kind of crying. And the next quarter she quietly restructured her calendar so that 5-0 Rig was never negotiable again, a decision that, against Griffin Hale's predictions, did absolutely nothing to hurt Rivermark's growth, and everything to steady her heart. It was good. It was, in fact, the best either of them had felt in years, but neither of them had said the word yet. Not girlfriend, not partner, not anything. They existed in the comfortable, undefined space of 2 people who were terrified, for very different reasons, of naming what they had, in case naming it made it fragile. Ava's reason was simple and old. Her last relationship had ended when her ex told her, flatly, that he couldn't compete with a company, and some bruised part of her still believed that anyone she loved would eventually resent the empire she'd built. Daniel's reason was harder to say out loud, even to himself. His wife's name had been Sarah. Sarah had loved mornings and terrible puns, and had once driven 4 hours in a snowstorm just to bring him soup when he had the flu. Daniel had grieved her fully, had done the work, had gone to the counseling, but some quiet, stubborn corner of him still felt that falling in love again was a kind of forgetting, and Daniel Reyes did not know how to forget anything on purpose, so they didn't say the word. And they just kept showing up. It was Milo's kindergarten family day that changed everything. The day the world made the world. Binamiva lems to mean weld. Before either of them had worked up the courage to make it themselves. Family day was exactly what it sounded like. Parents invited into the classroom for arts and crafts, cupcakes, and a slideshow of family photos each child had submitted. Daniel had asked Ava to come, half joking, half hopeful, and she had cleared her entire calendar without a second thought, which told her something about herself that she wasn't ready to examine too closely yet. They arrived together. They sat together, knees nearly touching in chairs built for 5-year-olds, while Milo proudly narrated his family photo slide. A picture of the three of them at the Dinosaur Pizza place, Milo grinning with a mouth full of missing teeth, Ava laughing at something off camera, Daniel's arms slung easily along the back of her chair. "That's my mom in heaven," Milo announced to the class, pointing at a photo of Sarah. There was a small, respectful pause. The kind kindergarten teachers are trained to navigate gracefully. "And that's my dad. And that's Ava. She's basically my other mom now." The room predictably melted. One of the other mothers turned to Ava with the warm, conspiratorial smile of someone welcoming a new member into an exclusive club. "You two are just the sweetest couple," she said. "How long have you been married?" Ava opened her mouth. The correction was right there. "We're not married. We haven't even said we're official. It's complicated." But before she could say any of it, she caught Daniel's eyes across the small classroom table. He wasn't laughing it off. He wasn't correcting it either. He was just watching her, waiting, his whole face open and unguarded in a way she had rarely seen it. And Ava, brilliant, fierce, $40 million company Ava, who negotiated with investors without blinking, and who had never once in her adult life let an inaccurate assumption stand uncorrected in a business meeting, smiled instead. "Almost 2 years," she heard herself say. It wasn't even close to true, but it didn't feel like a lie. It felt, for the first time, like she had finally said out loud the thing she had been too afraid to say quietly. The other mother beamed and moved on to compliment Milo's crayon dinosaur. Daniel didn't say anything for the rest of the slideshow, but under the tiny table, his hand found Ava's, and he held it like he was afraid it might disappear if he let go. They didn't talk about it on the drive home, not with Milo in the back seat singing along, off-key and gloriously unbothered, to the radio. But after Milo was asleep, after the dishes were done and the house had gone quiet, Daniel found Ava in the kitchen and said, "You didn't correct her." "No," Ava agreed. "Why not?" Ava set down the mug she'd been holding, wrapped tight in both hands, like it was the only warm thing in the room. "Because I didn't want it to not be true anymore," she said. "I've been so scared of saying it first. I built a whole company because I was scared of needing anyone. And then I met a 5-year-old who thinks I'm Muvyuryu, who has been quietly rearranging his entire heart to make room for me. And I realized I wasn't scared of loving you. I was scared of how much I already do." Daniel crossed the kitchen in 3 steps. "I haven't said it because I felt guilty," he admitted, voice rough. "Like loving you again meant loving her less. But that's not how it works, is it? Sarah gave me Milo. She gave me a whole life I loved. And somehow, impossibly, there's room for another one. There's room for you. I love you, Ava. I think I have for a while. I just didn't know how to say it without feeling like I was betraying something." "You're not betraying anything," Ava said, her eyes wet. "You're just choosing to keep living. That's not the same as forgetting." They stood in that kitchen for a long time, foreheads together, both of them finally saying, out loud, what a room full of kindergarten parents had somehow understood before they did. The proposal itself happened almost a year to the day after that kindergarten slideshow, though Daniel would later insist it had been in motion far longer than that. He didn't plan anything elaborate. No flash mob, no skywriting, none of the grand gestures Ava had watched other partners attempt at company holiday parties. All sparkle and no substance. Instead, on an unremarkable Sunday morning, while Milo built an elaborate blanket fort in the living room and narrated it like a nature documentary. Daniel simply knelt down in the kitchen where they'd shashtu, once stood forehead to forehead, admitting the truth to each other, and asked her to marry him in the same plain, steady voice he used for everything that mattered most. Milo, alerted by some unerring instinct children seem to have for the exact moment they are needed, came sprinting out of his fort, holding the small plastic dinosaur that would later hold their wedding rings, and shouted, "Say yes, I already picked out my suit," which effectively ended any possibility of Ava keeping her composure. She said yes through tears and laughter simultaneously, which Daniel later said was, in his professional medical opinion, an entirely normal human response to joy. Planning the wedding turned into its own small, sweet chapter of the story. Ava, so used to running a company with military precision, found herself oddly undone by seating charts and flower arrangements, and eventually threw up her hands and handed the whole thing over to her sister, the same sister whose rehearsal dinner she had nearly missed the day this entire story began. A detail nobody let her forget. Milo insisted on approving every element personally, vetoing a particular shade of blue tablecloth because it looked too much like a shark tank without sharks in it, and demanding, successfully, that the cake include at least one dinosaur, a request the baker met with admirable creativity. Ava's mother cried on the phone every single Sunday for 2 months straight, alternating between joy and disbelief that her daughter, who had once sworn off marriage entirely during a particularly rough stretch after her last relationship ended, was now anxiously debating whether the backyard string lights should be warm white or soft amber. The wedding, when it happened 8 months later, was small. A backyard, string lights, Milo in Durain. A tiny bow tie insisting on carrying the rings inside a small plastic dinosaur instead of a Priscillo, because it's cooler. Ava's father, the same man who once told her she was too soft for business, cried through the entire ceremony and told her afterward, quietly, that he had been wrong, that the strongest thing she had ever built wasn't her company. It was this. It was choosing, deliberately and without any spreadsheet to guide her, to let herself be loved. Rivermark kept growing. Daniel kept working his ICU shifts, still saving lives, still coming home exhausted in the particular way that meant he'd still but done something that mattered. Griffinhale, to nobody's great surprise, eventually sold his stake and moved on to a company, more interested in his particular brand of relentlessness. Rivermark's board seat he left behind was filled by a woman named Priya Chandrasekaran, who, on her very first day, told Ava that the healthiest founders she'd ever backed were the ones who had something to go home to. Ava had laughed out loud at that, a real laugh, and thought, not for the first time, about how far she'd come from the woman who once believed love and ambition couldn't share the same life. Milo turned 6, then 7. Developed an obsession with sharks that briefly rivaled the dinosaur years, and insisted on a marine biology-themed birthday party that required Ava to track down a bounce house shaped like a great white shark, a feat of party planning logistics that she was, frankly, prouder of than several of her company's product launches. Daniel took on a mentorship role for newer ICU nurses, passing along the steadiness he'd built through his hardest years, and found, to his quiet surprise, that teaching others how to sit with grief and fear in a hospital room came easier now that and learned how to sit with his own. There were still hard days. There is no version of this story, or any real love story, where the hard days simply stop coming. There were nights Daniel came home and couldn't talk about what he'd seen, and Ava learned to simply make him tea and sit close, without demanding words. There were weeks Ava traveled for Rivermark and missed a school pickup or a bedtime, and she learned to call every single night, no matter the time zone, because Milo had once told her, with the particular ruthless honesty of a 7-year-old, that a phone call still counted as showing up. There was even a difficult stretch, in Milo's 2nd grade year, when a well-meaning classmate asked him why he had 2 moms and one of them wasn't real, A comment that sent him home in tears and sent Ava into a fierce, protective anger she hadn't known she was capable of. She sat with him on his bed that night, Daniel on his other side, and told him the truest thing she knew. Love isn't a pie, Milo. There isn't a limited amount of it that has to be divided up and taken from someone else. Your mom loved you completely. I love you completely. Both of those things get to be true at the exact same time, forever. Milo had nodded, solemn as only a child weighing something enormous can be, and asked if he could have ice cream, which Ava took, correctly, as a sign of recovery. And then, one ordinary Tuesday evening, over spaghetti, Milo looked up at Ava with the same unfiltered honesty he'd had since the day she met him, and said, "Can I call you Mom?" Not instead of my other mom, just also. Ava had to leave the table for a minute. When she came back, her eyes were red, and she said yes. Years later, when Milo was old enough to understand more of the story in full, he asked Ava why she never corrected that mother in his kindergarten classroom, the one who had assumed they were already married. By then he was 12, all elbows and shark facts traded for something closer to teenage cool, but he still asked questions with the same unflinching directness he'd had at 5. Ava thought about it for a long moment before she answered. "Because I think some truths arrive before we're brave enough to say them," she told him. "That mother didn't know anything I didn't already know. She just said it out loud before I could. And once I heard it said out loud, in that ordinary, matter-of-fact way, like it was already obvious to the whole world, I realized I didn't want to argue with it. I wanted to earn it." Milo had nodded slowly, filing the answer away the way he filed away everything. And later, Ava overheard him repeating a version of it to a friend from school who was nervous about telling someone how he felt. Love, it turned out, had a way of passing itself forward, quietly, generation to generation. The way it had first arrived for her, on a crowded airplane, next to a tired father and a boy who loved dinosaurs. There is a particular kind of love story that doesn't begin with fireworks. It begins in the quiet, unglamorous places. A cramped airplane row, a hospital hallway, a cramped kindergarten classroom with tiny chairs, and a slideshow nobody expected to change 3 lives. It begins with a woman too tired to correct a stranger's assumption, and realizing, in the space of that silence, that she had never wanted anything corrected less. Ava never did go back and clarify the truth to that kindergarten mom. She didn't have to. 2 years became real. The family the world assumed they already were became the family they chose, on purpose, every single day after. And if you ever find yourself in a moment where the truth is smaller than what your heart already knows to be true, maybe don't correct it either. Maybe just let it become real. If this story moved you even a little, let us know in the comments. Hit that subscribe button, and we'll see you in the next one.